Europe is freaking out because a former US military officer ended up publicly exposing the scam that Trump has been denouncing for years against the old European elite. This Friday, June 5th, 2026, Scott Ritter's statement gained traction in the international debate because it didn't come from an automatic Trump ally or a conservative trying to defend the White House. It came from a former United States Marine and former UN weapons inspector speaking about global security, the nuclear arms race, diplomatic failure, and Europe's political vacuum. The blow made old Europe uncomfortable because Ritter stated that the continent has lost its direction, lives off moral appearances, and depends on the United States. And even so, it tries to push the world into a dangerous phase of rearmament. What was Europe trying to hide? How the old European elite was exposed, I'll tell you all about it in a moment. If you like this kind of straightforward, no-nonsense content, consider subscribing because we have videos like this every day. Scott Ritter made the statement during a speech in St. Petersburg, Russia, while discussing the collapse of diplomacy, the end of major nuclear control treaties, and the return of an arms race between powers. He used his experience as a former military officer and former weapons inspector to say that the world has entered a more unstable phase. Without strong agreements between Washington and Moscow, without trust between governments, and without real diplomatic leadership. But the part that caused a political explosion was another one. When talking about Europe, Ritter said that it doesn't have a clear foundation of its own, doesn't know exactly what it stands for, and tries to separate itself from the United States without having enough strength to stand on its own. That's when his statement becomes ammunition against the old Europe's narrative. During this, Duranty said that it's not clear alone. Duranty said that a clear foundation doesn't know exactly that the United States doesn't try. Duranty said that a clear foundation, exactly what it stands for, separates enough too. Duranty has its own foundation that it stands for and tries. Duranty, but now the security debate itself shows the opposite. Only Duranty said that clear, tries exactly to stand for, and tries the United States without. During this, he said clear, tries to separate from the United States without having its own foundation to move forward. Duranty's demand has become the new rule of the game. NATO has set a goal of spending 5% of GDP on defense by 2035, with 3.5% allocated to core military expenses and 1.5% to areas related to security. In other words, Europe spent years complaining about Trump, but ended up footing the bill Trump was demanding. The problem with old Europe isn't just spending too little. The problem is pretending to be a leader while outsourcing its own security. Washington is now pressuring European allies and Canada to provide more planes, drones, ships, refueling aircraft, and naval capabilities to cover gaps within NATO. The demand comes precisely at a time when the Trump administration is reducing the availability of some American forces for the alliance. This confirms the core of the conservative thesis. The United States can't keep footing the bill alone. A structure in which European bureaucrats speak as if they are the leaders of the world, but run to American protection when a crisis hits. Hitler's speech also hits the European Union at another sensitive point. Brussels tries to sell the Readiness 2030 plan as a sign of autonomy and strength, promising to mobilize up to 800 billion euros in defense. The package includes more fiscal flexibility for the bloc's nations, more funding for military purchases, and a 150 billion euro loan instrument. In practice, it shows an elite that woke up late after years of depending on the United States, buying energy from adversaries, dismantling part of its own military capability, and treating sovereignty as a dirty word. Germany has become the clearest symbol of this shift. The country that for decades avoided a major military role is now accelerating defense spending, reforming its planning, and that's not all. Germany is trying to regain its combat capability. The Stockholm International Peace Research Institute recorded that the European members of NATO spent a combined $559 billion on defense in 2025. Germany emerged as the largest military spender among the European group, with an increase of 24% compared to the previous year, and a military expenditure above 2.3% of its GDP. This data shows that Germany is trying to rearm. It is rearming. The uncomfortable detail is that this rearmament did not come from strong European leadership. It was born out of fear. Fear of Russia, fear of losing total protection from the United States, fear of Trump's return, fear of not being able to support Ukraine, fear of a bigger war, and fear of showing their own people that the promise of eternal peace was fragile. Old Europe spent years thinking that borders, energy, the military industry, and national sovereignty were outdated topics. Now it's rushing back to all those topics because reality has come knocking at the door. Trump saw this contradiction before the Brussels elite admitted it. When he demanded that allies pay more for their own defense, he was called a radical. When he criticized Europe's dependence, he was treated as a threat. When he talked about protecting the American taxpayer, he was accused of attacking the alliance. Now, the facts show that the alliance only started to move because Washington put on the pressure. Without American pressure, much of Europe would have continued talking about values while leaving the military burden on the shoulders of the United States. Scott Ritter tried to make a broad critique of the United States, Russia, and the international system, but the part that hurt Europe was the most revealing. He stated that the United States still has a constitution, a political foundation, and a national identity to which it can return. Europe, on the other hand, appears in his speech as a bloc without a center, without direction, and without foundation. This difference is essential. Trump's America is driven by national interest. Old Europe is driven by bureaucracy, fear, and moralistic discourse. The nuclear crisis mentioned by Ritter also fits into this picture. The New START, the last major strategic arms control treaty between the United States and Russia, came to an end in February 2026. This ushered in a phase without the same level of formal limitation on the strategic arsenals between the two largest nuclear powers. Ritter uses this scenario to warn about the risk of an arms race, but Europe talks about global security, yet doesn't have enough influence to reorganize the table. She depends on Washington to negotiate, contain, protect, and give permission. Old Europe freaks out because it lost the monopoly on the pretty speech. Before, it was enough to call Trump an isolationist to avoid being held accountable. Now the bill is on the table. Either Europe takes responsibility for its own defense, or admits it needs the United States, or respects American leadership, or shows that its autonomy was just propaganda. When even critics of Washington describe Europe as empty, dependent, and dangerous, it becomes hard for Brussels to pretend that everything is under control. Old Europe tried to ridicule America first, but now it's experiencing its practical effects. I'm Milson Alves, global internationalist, and my purpose is to keep you well informed with the truth every day. The news links are in the video description. Leave a like on this video, subscribe to the channel, and at the end, check out the comments so you can be even more engaged with the Milson Alves global community.